Your scar is the only inheritance you deserve, Ottilie. The words fell across the drawing room like a blade. Lady Corisande Ashcombe did not lower her voice when she spoke them. She wanted every guest gathered beneath the chandelier to hear. She wanted every cousin, every neighbor, every family acquaintance seated around the polished table to witness the humiliation of the woman who stood before them. Ottilie Ashcombe remained beside the fireplace, one gloved hand resting lightly against the edge of the mantel. The warmth of the flames touched the room, but she felt only the cold that had followed her since the evening began. The scar along the side of her face had always been something her family refused to see as anything except a flaw, a mark from an accident years before, a reminder of a night when she had saved a younger child from a carriage path and paid the price with her own skin. To Ottilie, it was proof that she had acted when others had frozen. To her stepmother, it was an embarrassment. Lady Corisande lifted her teacup and smiled faintly. How fortunate that society still values kindness, because beauty alone could never have carried you very far. A few people laughed, not loudly, not cruelly enough to admit what they were doing, but they laughed. Lord Edmund Ashcombe, Ottilie's father, remained seated near the window. He heard every word. He saw the color leave his daughter's face. Yet he only adjusted his cuff and looked away. That silence hurt more than Corisande's insult. Ottilie had expected cruelty from the woman who had spent years measuring every daughter in the household by marriage prospects and inheritance value. She had not expected her own father to choose comfort over courage. The room grew still when Corisande stepped closer. Tomorrow, the family accounts will be discussed. Since you have no realistic prospects and no husband willing to overlook such a difficulty, it may be time you understood your position in this house. Ottilie looked at her. My position? Corisande's smile sharpened, a dependent one. The servants standing near the doorway lowered their eyes. They knew better than to speak. They had seen this family change after the death of Lady Ashcombe, Ottilie's mother. They had watched Corisande enter the household with a soft voice and expensive gowns, then slowly replace affection with control. That night, however, none of them knew that the insult delivered beneath the chandelier would become the first crack in a secret, powerful enough to shake Ashcombe Manor itself. If you are listening to this story, tell us where you are joining from tonight. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another tale of forgotten voices finding justice. Your support helps us continue sharing stories of courage, dignity, and the truths hidden behind grand estates. Now, let us return to the beginning of Ottilie Ashcombe's journey. Before the scar became the subject of whispers, before her family turned it into a weapon, Ottilie had been known as the quiet daughter of Ashcombe Manor. The estate stood among dark fields and ancient trees in the English countryside, its stone walls rising above the village of Ashcombe, like a monument to a family that believed tradition mattered more than compassion. It was a place where portraits of ancestors watched every hallway, where silver trays appeared at breakfast, where the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel path could announce a guest important enough to change the mood of the entire house. Ottilie had grown up understanding that she was not the child her father had hoped for. Lord Edmund had wanted a son, a boy who could inherit the estate, a boy who could carry the family name. Instead, he had received a daughter who loved books, gardens, and the careful study of household records. Ottilie was not rebellious. She did not challenge society openly. She simply possessed a mind that refused to remain empty. Her mother, Lady Eleanor Ashcombe, had been the one person who understood her. When Ottilie was young, Eleanor had told her that a person was not measured by the opinions of those who held power over them. But after Eleanor's death, those words became harder to believe. Corisande arrived at Ashcombe Manor within a year. She was elegant, controlled, and admired by everyone outside the household. Her dresses were always perfect. Her manners were always polished. She knew exactly when to smile and exactly when to appear wounded. At first, Ottilie believed her new stepmother might offer companionship. She was wrong. Corisande saw the estate as something waiting to be managed. She saw every person inside it as either useful or inconvenient. Ottilie became inconvenient. The problem was not only the scar. The scar simply gave Corisande something visible to point toward. The true reason was money. After Lady Eleanor's death, a portion of her personal fortune had been placed under arrangements that Ottilie would receive when she reached a certain age. It was not enough to make her wealthy, but it was enough to provide independence. Corisande wanted control of that money. More importantly, she wanted Edmund Ashcombe to believe his daughter was incapable of managing anything herself. A daughter who married well would strengthen the family. A daughter who remained unmarried and independent would become a question, and Corisande disliked questions. Over the years, Ottilie noticed small changes. Letters addressed to her sometimes arrived opened. Invitations from distant acquaintances disappeared. A solicitor who had once written to discuss her mother's arrangements suddenly stopped visiting. Whenever Ottilie asked about these things, Corisande answered with perfect calm. "You misunderstand the responsibilities of a household. Not every matter requires your attention." Ottilie learned to watch rather than argue. It was the first time in her life she discovered that silence could be a form of protection, but it could also become a prison. The accident that left her scarred happened during a winter evening when Ottilie was 17. Rain had turned the roads near the village into mud. A carriage carrying the children of a neighboring family lost control near a narrow crossing. People shouted. The horses panicked. Everyone moved backward. Ottilie moved forward. She pulled a young girl away moments before the carriage struck the stone barrier. The broken edge of the carriage window cut her face. The injury healed. The memory did not. When she returned home, she expected concern. Instead, she saw disappointment in her father's eyes. Not because she had been hurt, because she had been marked. Corisande never forgot that moment. From then on, she treated the scar as evidence that Ottilie had destroyed her own chances in society. "You should have known your place," she once said. Ottilie had never understood those words, because her place, according to her heart, had been wherever someone needed help. By the winter evening of the gathering, Ottilie was 24 years old. In the eyes of many families, that age already placed a woman in a difficult position. A woman without a husband was often treated as unfinished. A woman without a fortune was treated as a burden. A woman with a scar was judged even more harshly. But Ottilie had something Corisande never expected. She remembered. She remembered every conversation, every missing letter, every account book removed from the library, every moment when her father looked away. The following morning, after the humiliation in the drawing room, Ottilie was instructed to remain in her rooms until the family meeting. It was not called punishment. Corisande was too careful for that. It was called consideration. The household staff understood what it meant. Ottilie sat beside the window of her chamber and watched rain strike the glass. The garden outside was dark and empty. The cold had settled over Ashcombe Manor, wrapping the estate in the same silence that had protected injustice for years. Then someone knocked softly. It was Mrs. Bell, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Ashcombe family since before Ottilie's birth. She carried a small wooden box, not an expensive one, not decorated with jewels, just old, scratched wood with a tiny lock. Ottilie looked at it in surprise. Mrs. Bell closed the door carefully. "Your mother asked me to keep this until the day you needed it." Ottilie's heart tightened. "Why did you never tell me?" "Because she made me promise. And because your mother feared this day might come." Mrs. Bell placed the box into Ottilie's hands. Inside was a folded paper, aged but carefully preserved. A letter. Ottilie reached toward it, but the older woman stopped her. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because there is something else you must know." Mrs. Bell looked toward the door. "The household has not been as blind as you believed." Ottilie felt the first spark of hope she had allowed herself in years. Mrs. Bell continued quietly. "Your mother trusted very few people, but she trusted me. And she left instructions that this box should only be opened when someone tried to take away what belonged to you." Outside, thunder moved across the winter sky. For the first time in years, Ottilie did not feel like someone waiting for judgment. She felt like someone standing before a hidden door. But before she could open it, footsteps stopped outside her room. Someone was listening. And whoever stood beyond that door had already discovered that Ottilie Ashcombe was no longer willing to remain silent. The footsteps outside Ottilie's chamber did not move away. For several moments, Neither Ottilie nor Mrs. Bell spoke. The old housekeeper stood beside the door, her expression changing from concern to certainty. She had spent decades learning the language of Ashcombe Manor. She knew the difference between a guest waiting politely and someone hoping to steal a conversation. Mrs. Bell moved quietly toward the entrance and opened it without warning. No one stood there. Only the long corridor remained, lit by weak candlelight. The portraits along the walls seemed to watch them with the same cold judgment that had filled the drawing room the previous evening. But on the carpet near the doorway lay a small piece of folded paper. Ottilie bent down and picked it up. Her fingers tightened as she recognized the handwriting. It belonged to Corisande. Not a letter, not a message. A list. Several names were written across the page. Servants, villagers, a solicitor. And beside some of them were short notes. Unreliable, too curious. Must be dismissed. Ottilie read the words twice. This was not simply cruelty, it was preparation. Corisande had not been insulting her because she disliked the scar. The scar was only the excuse. The real plan had been forming quietly for years. She wanted Ottilie isolated. She wanted every person who might remember Eleanor Ashcombe's wishes removed before the truth could be spoken. Mrs. Bell watched her carefully. Now you understand why your mother was afraid. Ottilie looked back at the old housekeeper. Why did my father allow this? The question came out softer than she expected. Mrs. Bell lowered her eyes. Because your father was not a cruel man when your mother lived. The words hurt more than an accusation. He became one after? No, he became a frightened one. The housekeeper folded her hands. Some people choose wrong because they enjoy power. Others choose wrong because admitting the truth would mean admitting how long they remained silent. Ottilie turned toward the locked wooden box. For years, she had believed her father simply did not care. Now she wondered if something more complicated had happened, not something that excused him, something that made his failure harder to forgive. That afternoon, while the family gathered in the library, Ottilie entered without waiting for permission. The room changed immediately. Lord Edmund sat behind the large desk, where generations of Ashcombes had signed agreements, written letters, and made decisions that shaped the lives of everyone beneath them. Corisande stood beside him. Her expression was calm. Too calm. Ottilie placed the folded list on the desk. You dropped this outside my room. For the first time, Corisande's composure slipped, only for a second. But Ottilie saw it. A person who had nothing to fear would have laughed. A person who had been discovered would have remained silent. Corisande chose anger. How dare you enter my private affairs? Ottilie looked at her father. Is this private? Lord Edmund glanced at the paper. His face changed, only slightly, but enough. You searched through my things? Ottilie shook her head. No. I found proof that my life has been managed without my knowledge. Corisande stepped forward. Do not pretend you understand matters beyond you. This household has survived because decisions are made by those capable of making them. Ottilie looked around the library. The locked cabinets, the account books, the shelves where her mother had once spent evenings reading. Then she looked back at Corisande. You mean those who control the information? The room became silent. Not the silence of peace, the silence of people hearing a truth they wished had remained hidden. Lord Edmund stood. Enough. Ottilie watched him carefully. For years that word had meant one thing. Stop speaking. But this time, she noticed something different. His voice lacked confidence. Corisande noticed it too. She immediately softened her expression. Edmund, you cannot allow this. She is distressed. She has always struggled with accepting her circumstances. Ottilie felt the familiar wound open, not because of Corisande's words, because her father still allowed them to exist. But before he could answer, another voice came from the doorway. I believe Lady Ottilie is asking a reasonable question. Everyone turned. It was Mr. Henry Vale, the solicitor who had handled several Ashcombe family matters before his visits mysteriously stopped. He stood with a leather case in his hand. Corisande's face lost its colour. Mr. Vale. The solicitor inclined his head. Lady Corisande. I had not expected such a warm welcome. Lord Edmund looked confused. Why are you here? Mr. Vale opened his case. Because I received a letter from Mrs. Bell yesterday morning, and because I believe certain documents connected to Lady Eleanor Ashcombe's arrangements require immediate attention. Ottilie stared at him. The room seemed to shift beneath her feet. A solicitor, her mother's arrangements. Documents. Words she had heard whispered, but never confirmed. Corisande recovered quickly. This is absurd. Whatever my late wife arranged was years ago. Mr. Vale did not raise his voice. No, it was arranged carefully. There is a difference. He removed a sealed envelope from his case. The seal was old, but unmistakable. The Ashcombe family mark. Lord Edmund stared at it. Where did you get that? Mr. Vale looked toward Ottilie. Your wife entrusted it to me before her death. She instructed me not to open it unless her daughter's position within this household was threatened. No one spoke. The rain struck against the windows. The fire continued burning, but the warmth of the room seemed to disappear. Corisande reached toward the envelope. That document is irrelevant. Mr. Vale stepped back. Then why are you afraid of it? The question remained hanging between them. Ottilie looked at Corisande. For the first time, she saw something she had never seen before. Not confidence, fear. Small, hidden, but real. The woman who had spent years making others feel powerless had finally encountered something she could not command. Mr. Vale placed the envelope into Ottilie's hands. You should read this somewhere private, Lady Ottilie. She held it tightly. But before she could leave, her father spoke. Ottilie, she stopped. The entire room waited. Lord Edmund looked older than he had the night before. I should have protected you. The admission was quiet, almost lost beneath the storm outside. Ottilie looked at him. A part of her had waited years to hear those words, but another part had learned that words without action could not repair everything. She answered carefully, I needed protection when I was young, father. A pause. Now I need the truth. She left the library carrying the envelope. Behind her, the door closed. And for the first time since entering Ashcombe Manor, Ottilie did not feel like someone being sent away. She felt like someone walking towards something. But inside the sealed letter was a truth that would not only challenge Corisande's control, it would reveal that the danger surrounding Ottilie had begun long before anyone ever mocked her scar. Ottilie did not open the letter immediately. She carried it upstairs to her chamber and placed it beside the wooden box that had waited for her all these years. The envelope seemed heavier than paper should have been. It was not simply a message from her mother. It was a voice from a time when Ottilie had still believed that the people around her would protect her. Mrs. Bell remained near the door. Shall I leave you, my lady? Ottilie looked at the sealed letter. No. Then she hesitated. Please stay. The old housekeeper nodded. There were some burdens that became lighter when another person simply remained nearby. Ottilie broke the seal. The handwriting inside was unmistakable. Her mother's letters had always been elegant but warm. Every line seemed to carry patience. Even now, years after Eleanor Ashcombe's death, Ottilie could almost hear her voice. My dearest Ottilie, if you are reading this, then something has happened that forced this letter into your hands before I wished it to be. Ottilie swallowed. The words already frightened her. The letter continued. Your father is not a man who seeks harm, but he has always feared scandal more than he feared injustice. That weakness has been used against him. Ottilie lowered the paper. Mrs. Bell looked at her. Your mother knew. She knew everything. Not everything. The housekeeper looked toward the window, but she knew enough to prepare. Ottilie continued reading. Eleanor wrote that before her death she had discovered irregularities in the estate accounts, payments made without explanation, changes to household arrangements that had not been approved, documents removed from the family library. But one detail made Ottilie's hands tremble. Her mother had suspected that someone intended to alter the future of Ashcombe Manor, not through violence, not through open rebellion, through patience, through small changes that no one noticed until the entire structure belonged to someone else. Ottilie read the final lines of the first page. Never mistake a quiet person for a powerless one. Those who listen carefully often know more than those who speak the loudest. For years, Ottilie had thought her quiet nature was the reason people ignored her. Now she wondered if it had been the very thing that allowed her to see what others missed. The next morning, Ashcombe Manor woke under a sky of heavy grey clouds. The household continued as if nothing had changed. That was the strangest part. Servants carried breakfast trays, fireplaces were tended, carriages arrived at the front entrance. The world outside did not know that the foundations of the family were shifting. Ottilie understood something then. Secrets rarely announced themselves. They waited, they gathered strength, and eventually they demanded to be heard. But Corisande was not waiting. She moved first. By afternoon, Ottilie received a message requesting her presence in the morning room. When she entered, she found not only Corisande, but also Lord Edmund. A document sat on the table. Ottilie recognized the style immediately. It was a formal agreement. Corisande gestured toward the chair. "Sit down." Ottilie remained standing. "What is this?" Her stepmother smiled. "A practical solution." "To what?" "To your future." The answer came quickly. Corisande folded her hands. "You have spent enough years living under the protection of this family. Society is not kind to women who refuse to accept reality." Ottilie looked at her father. "Reality?" Lord Edmund did not answer. Corisande continued. "There is a respectable household in London seeking a companion for an elderly widow. You would be comfortable, provided for, removed from unnecessary pressure." Removed. The word stayed in the air. Ottilie understood immediately. This was not an opportunity. It was exile, a polite version of being sent away. She looked at the document. "And if I refuse?" Corisande's expression remained pleasant. "Then we will have to reconsider your allowance." Lord Edmund finally spoke. "Ottilie, perhaps this arrangement would give you independence." She turned toward him. "Independence?" Her voice was calm. "Or distance?" The room went quiet, not because she had raised her voice, because she had not. Corisande had always expected emotion. Tears, anger, a desperate plea. Ottilie gave her none. That was what unsettled her. Ottilie walked to the table and examined the paper. There was no mention of her mother's arrangements. No mention of the money placed aside for her. No mention of the questions raised by Mr. Vale. Only a carefully prepared path away from Ashcombe Manor. A path that would leave Corisande with fewer obstacles. "I will consider it." Corisande blinked. "You will?" "Yes." Ottilie placed the document back. "Because I have spent years being told that I cannot make decisions." A faint pause. "I would like to experience making one." It was the first time in her life that Ottilie had openly refused to accept an order disguised as kindness. The moment was small. No one applauded. No one stood to defend her. But inside herself, something changed. For the first time in her life, she chose her own answer. Not the answer expected of her. Not the answer that kept peace, her own. That evening, Ottilie visited the servants' quarters. It was unusual. A woman of her position was not expected to spend time there unless giving instructions. But the servants had always known more about Ashcombe Manor than the family believed. Mrs. Bell introduced her to Thomas, the former footman who had worked at the estate for 30 years before retiring to a small cottage near the village. He removed his hat respectfully. "Lady Ottilie, thank you for coming." Ottilie sat across from him. "I need to ask you something." Thomas nodded. "I know." She looked surprised. "You know?" The old man gave a tired smile. "Everyone who has served this house long enough knows when something is wrong." He told her that shortly after Lady Eleanor's death, he had been ordered to move several boxes from the library. "Who gave the order?" "Lady Corisande." "What was inside?" Thomas looked down. "I do not know, but one box was marked with your mother's name." Ottilie's breath caught. "Did you move it?" "No." Thomas looked up. "I hid it." The answer shocked her. "Why?" "Because your mother once defended my daughter when the village refused to let her work after a mistake she made." He paused. "Kindness is remembered, my lady, especially by those who have little else." Thomas explained that he had hidden the box temporarily, intending to return it to Ottilie when she was older. But then he was dismissed. The box disappeared. Or so he thought. Ottilie looked at Mrs. Bell. Another piece, another missing piece, and every piece led back to the same place. The library, the locked room where the family stored its history. That night, while the rest of Ashcombe Manor slept, Ottilie stood outside the library door. The corridor was cold. The candle in her hand flickered. Behind that door were the records of generations, and somewhere among them was the truth her mother had died protecting. She reached for the handle. It was locked. But before she could turn away, she noticed something. A small scratch near the lock. Recent. Someone had entered. Someone had been searching. And whoever had searched the library had not been looking for something valuable. They had been looking for something that could destroy them. Ottilie remained in the corridor, staring at the marks around the lock. For years, she had believed the library was simply a room filled with old books and family records. A place where her father worked, where decisions were made, where history rested quietly behind polished wooden doors. Now she understood something different. The library was not where the Ashcombes kept their memories. It was where they kept their power. She returned to her chamber and waited. Not because she was afraid, because she had learned that rushing toward the truth often gave the person hiding it the advantage. The next morning, Ottilie watched carefully. She noticed Corisande leaving the breakfast room earlier than usual. She noticed the way the woman checked the corridor before entering the library. She noticed the servant carrying fresh candles toward that same door. Small things, things others ignored. But Ottilie had spent her whole life being ignored. And she had become very good at noticing what everyone else missed. She followed at a distance. The hallway outside the library was empty except for a narrow gap between the door and the frame. Ottilie stopped. She did not listen because she wanted to invade someone's privacy. She listened because the people inside had spent years invading hers. Corisande's voice came first. "You assured me the papers were gone," a man answered. The voice belonged to Mr. Carlyle, the estate accountant who had replaced the previous clerk after Eleanor's death. "I removed everything I could find." "Everything?" There was hesitation. That was enough. Corisande noticed it too. "What did you leave behind?" "Nothing important. That is not an answer." The room became silent. Ottilie felt her heartbeat quicken. Then Mr. Carlyle spoke again. There was one reference to Lady Eleanor's private arrangements, but it was incomplete. Without the original documents, it proves nothing. Corisande lowered her voice. "Then find the original." A pause. "And if Lady Ottilie has already found it?" The answer came instantly. "Then we make certain no one believes her." Ottilie stepped away from the door. The words did not shock her as much as they should have, perhaps because some part of her had always known. The cruelty had never been accidental. The insults had never been random. Every humiliation had served a purpose. She returned to her room before anyone noticed her absence. But this time, she did not cry. She sat at her desk and opened her mother's letter again. The ink seemed different now, the warnings clearer. "Your quiet nature may become your greatest protection." Ottilie looked at the sentence for a long moment. Then she opened the small wooden box again. Beneath the first letter was another folded document. She had not noticed it before, a list of dates, payments, names. At first, the information seemed meaningless. Then she saw a familiar name, Mr. Carlyle. Next to it were several amounts withdrawn from the estate accounts. Ottilie reached for a blank sheet of paper and began copying everything. Not because she fully understood it, because she knew something important. Facts became stronger when they were written down. That afternoon, she visited the village. It was the first time in years she had walked beyond the gates of Ashcombe Manor without a servant following behind her. The cold wind cut through her coat, and the road was covered with wet leaves. But the village did not look at her the way the drawing room had. Here, people cared less about appearances and more about whether someone had treated them fairly. Ottilie entered the small shop near the market square where old records were sometimes kept by the previous owner. The shopkeeper recognized her immediately. Lady Ottilie. She looked surprised. "You have not come here since you were a girl." Ottilie gave a small smile. "I think I have spent too long staying where others expected me to remain." The shopkeeper did not ask questions. Instead, she brought out an old collection of local notices and household records. Among them was a name Ottilie did not expect to see. Thomas Bell, the old footman. A note from years earlier confirmed that Thomas had delivered several sealed parcels from Lady Eleanor before her death. But one entry was marked differently. Private delivery. Recipient, Lady Eleanor Ashcombe's daughter. Ottilie stared. She had never received anything, not because her mother had failed to send it, because someone had stopped it from reaching her. When Ottilie returned to Ashcombe Manor that evening, she found Mrs. Bell waiting near the servants' entrance. The old housekeeper's expression told her something had happened. "What is it?" Mrs. Bell looked around before speaking. "Lady Corisande dismissed one of the young maids today." "Why?" "Because she believed the girl had heard something she should not have heard." Ottilie felt a familiar anger rise. "Who?" "Emily. The kitchen maid. Where is she now?" Mrs. Bell lowered her voice. "She has gone to her sister's cottage near the village." Ottilie immediately reached for her cloak. Mrs. Bell touched her arm. "My lady, be careful." Ottilie looked at her. "I have spent years being careful." A pause. "It did not save me." The old housekeeper understood. This was not the frightened young woman who had stood silently beneath the chandelier. This was someone who had finally realized that survival required more than patience. It required action. That night, Ottilie found Emily at the small cottage beyond the village road. The girl looked terrified when she opened the door. "Lady Ottilie, I need to know what happened." Emily hesitated. "If Lady Corisande finds out, she will already know what she wants you to fear." Ottilie's voice remained gentle. "Tell me the truth." Slowly, Emily revealed what she had seen. 2 nights earlier, she had been cleaning the library when she heard Corisande and Mr. Carlyle arguing. They were searching through old family records. They mentioned a document connected to Lady Eleanor. Emily had hidden behind the curtain until they left. Then she saw something on the desk. A key, a small brass key with the Ashcombe crest. Ottilie felt a chill. Where was it? Emily looked down. Lady Corisande took it. But before she left, she said something. "What?" The maid swallowed. She said, "The girl with the scar will never know what belonged to her." The words settled heavily, not because they were cruel, because they confirmed everything. Corisande did not hate the scar. She hated what the scar represented, a person she could not control, a person who had survived. On the journey back to Ashcombe Manor, Ottilie watched the lights glowing through the windows of the great house. For years, those windows had represented a place she belonged. Then they became a place where she was tolerated. Now they were something else, a battlefield. But this time, she was not entering it unprepared. She had a letter, she had records, she had witnesses, and she had finally understood that the greatest mistake her family had made was believing kindness meant weakness. The next morning, Ottilie would return to the library. Not to search, not to hide, but to take back the truth that had been kept from her. And waiting inside that locked room was the final piece of evidence that would reveal whether Ashcombe Manor had been built on honor or deception. The following morning, Ottilie did not go directly to the library. She understood now that truth was not only hidden in locked rooms, it was also hidden in the reactions of those who feared it. At breakfast, she entered the dining room as usual. Corisande sat beneath the tall windows, calmly reading a letter beside the silver tray. But when Ottilie appeared, the older woman's fingers tightened around the paper. Only briefly, only enough for Ottilie to notice. "Good morning, Lady Corisande." Her stepmother looked up. "Good morning." The reply was polite, too polite. Lord Edmund sat at the opposite end of the table, watching them both. For the first time, Ottilie noticed that he no longer looked annoyed by her questions. He looked uncertain. That uncertainty mattered. Ottilie took her seat and unfolded her napkin. "I visited the village yesterday." Corisande looked up sharply. "Did you?" "Yes. I spoke with people who remembered my mother." A pause followed. The servants moving around the room became quieter. Corisande placed her cup down. "Memories are unreliable things, Ottilie. Sometimes people remember what they wish had happened." Ottilie met her eyes. "And sometimes people hide what actually happened because they fear someone will remember." The room fell silent. Lord Edmund looked between them. Ottilie did not continue. She did not need to. She had learned that every accusation gave an enemy a chance to prepare, but every unanswered question created discomfort. and discomfort was something Corisande could not easily control. Later that morning, Ottilie returned to the library with Mr. Vale's assistance. The lock remained unchanged. But the moment she entered, she noticed something different. One drawer of the writing desk was slightly open. Inside was nothing except a small piece of torn ribbon. Ottilie picked it up. It was from an old document seal. Mrs. Bell examined it carefully. "This belonged to your mother's papers." Mr. Vale nodded. "Someone opened something here recently." Ottilie looked around the room. The books, the cabinets, the shelves, the place where her family had hidden its decisions for generations. She no longer saw a room that excluded her. She saw a room that had been waiting for her to ask the right questions. And beneath the desk, behind a row of old account books, she found a narrow space where the wood had been disturbed. Inside was a small envelope. No name, no seal, only one word written across the front. Eleanor. Ottilie held it carefully, because she finally understood. The truth had never disappeared. Someone had simply spent years making certain that she would never find it. Ottilie did not open the envelope immediately. She had learned enough about hidden truths to understand that some discoveries required preparation. A secret revealed too soon could be taken away. A witness questioned too quickly could be frightened into silence. A document shown to the wrong person could disappear before anyone else knew it existed. She carried the envelope back to her chamber and locked the door behind her. Mrs. Bell stood nearby, watching with a mixture of relief and worry. "Your mother knew this day might come." Ottilie looked at the envelope. "She knew someone might try to stop it." Mrs. Bell nodded. "That is why she trusted you would not open it until you were ready." Ottilie sat at her desk. For a moment, she thought of the girl she had been years before. A daughter who believed that if she behaved well enough, if she caused no trouble, if she endured quietly, eventually someone would notice. But no one had come. No one except herself. She opened the envelope. Inside was not a confession, it was a set of instructions. The first page contained a list of names, the second contained references to estate accounts, the third contained a note written in Eleanor Ashcombe's hand. Ottilie read slowly. "If these papers have reached you, then someone has attempted to remove your place within this family." Her breath caught. "But do not fight for a place at a table where others wish you to remain silent. Fight for the truth that allows you to choose whether you wish to sit there at all." Ottilie lowered the paper. The words were exactly what her mother would have said. Not anger, not revenge, choice. Beneath the note was something more important. A copy of an account showing a transfer of funds from Ashcombe Manor to an outside account shortly before Eleanor's death. The name attached to the approval was not Corisande's. It was Edmund Ashcombe's. Ottilie stared at it. Her father. For several moments, she could not move. Mrs. Bell saw her expression change. "What is it?" Ottilie did not answer immediately, because this was the part she had feared most. Not discovering that Corisande had deceived her, that had become almost expected. Discovering that her father had signed something, that was different. The man who had failed to defend her had also placed his name beside decisions that harmed her. The pain was quieter, deeper. She turned the page, but then she saw something else. A small, handwritten note from Eleanor. "Your father signed this under pressure. The original agreement remains incomplete without the second approval." Ottilie looked closer. There was another name. Corisande's. The document had required 2 signatures. The transfer had never been legally completed. It had only appeared complete because someone had hidden the missing page. Ottilie exhaled slowly. Not a mistake, not confusion, a plan. Mrs. Bell touched her shoulder gently. "What will you do?" Ottilie looked toward the window. Outside, the winter garden was covered with frost. For years, she had imagined justice as something that arrived from outside. A powerful person, a dramatic moment, someone stepping through the door to save her. But the truth was different. The first person who had to believe her was herself. "I will gather everything." Her voice was calm. "Every document, every witness, every person who remembers." Mrs. Bell smiled faintly. "That sounds like your mother." Ottilie folded the papers carefully. "No." She paused. "It sounds like me. That afternoon she began preparing. She did not announce a challenge. She did not confront Corisande. Instead, she visited the village again. She spoke with Thomas. She found Emily. She asked Mr. Vale to review every paper connected to her mother's arrangements. And she began writing down every detail she remembered from the past 8 years. Every missing letter, every changed instruction, every conversation that had seemed insignificant at the time. The work was slow, but it gave her something she had not possessed in years: direction. Meanwhile, inside Ashcombe Manor, Corisande grew impatient. She had expected Ottilie to break. She had expected tears, a request for forgiveness, an acceptance of the London arrangement. Instead, the girl she had spent years dismissing had become careful, and careful people were dangerous. That evening, Corisande entered Lord Edmund's study. He looked up from his papers. "You should not have delayed this." Corisande closed the door. "She is asking questions." Edmund's expression tightened. "What questions?" "The wrong ones." A long silence followed. Then Corisande spoke more softly. "If she discovers the account papers, everything changes." Edmund looked away. "I never intended for this to become what it has." Corisande's expression hardened, but it did. She stepped closer. "And you allowed it." The words struck him. Because they were true, not completely, but enough. Outside the study, unseen by both of them, a servant carrying fresh candles stopped in the hallway. The door was not fully closed, and once again the truth began moving through Ashcombe Manor from the lowest rooms upward. The servant said nothing, not yet. But by morning, another person would know that the family's greatest secret was no longer safely hidden. And Ottilie Ashcombe was no longer searching for proof that she had been wronged. She was preparing to prove exactly who had wronged her. The next morning, Ottilie discovered that the household had changed. Not openly. Ashcombe Manor was too well trained for open panic. The servants still carried breakfast trays. The fires were still tended. The curtains were still drawn at the proper hour. But something beneath the surface had shifted. People looked at her differently. Not with pity, not with curiosity, with recognition. They had begun to understand that Lady Ottilie Ashcombe was no longer the quiet daughter who accepted every decision made for her. She noticed it first when Emily approached her near the kitchen entrance. The young maid looked nervous, twisting her apron between her fingers. "My lady." Ottilie turned. "What is it?" Emily glanced around before speaking. "I wanted to tell you something before someone else could stop me." Ottilie waited. The girl took a small breath. "Mr. Carlyle came to the servants' hall last night." "Why?" "He was asking questions." "About me? About anyone who might have spoken with you?" Ottilie's expression remained calm, but her thoughts moved quickly. "Did he threaten you?" "No." Emily looked down. That was almost worse. He was polite. The kind of polite that makes a person understand there is danger without a single threat being spoken. Ottilie knew that kind of behavior. People who controlled others rarely needed to raise their voices. They relied on fear that had already been planted. "Did he mention anything?" Emily hesitated. "He asked whether I had seen anything in the library, and—" The maid looked up. "I told him I had not." A faint smile appeared on Ottilie's face. "Good." Emily looked surprised. "You are not angry that you lied?" Ottilie shook her head. "No. Sometimes the truth must be protected before it can be revealed." It was the first time Emily had heard Ottilie speak that way. Not like a noblewoman giving instructions, like someone who understood what it meant to have no power and still choose courage. Later that day, Mr. Vale arrived with additional documents. He requested a private conversation in the small sitting room away from the main part of the house. Ottilie placed the papers from her mother's box on the table. The solicitor examined each page carefully. "There is more here than I expected. What does it show?" Mr. Vale removed his spectacles. "It shows that your mother intended for certain funds to remain protected for your future." He paused. "But it also shows someone attempted to make it appear that you had no claim." Ottilie looked at the account records. "Can we prove who altered them?" "Not yet." The answer was honest, and Ottilie appreciated that. She had spent too long surrounded by people who softened the truth until it became useless. "But we can prove something else." "What?" that several people knew these arrangements existed. Mr. Vale tapped one page. Your stepmother, your father, and the estate accountant. Ottilie was silent. 3 people, 3 different choices. Corisande had acted. Mr. Carlyle had assisted. But her father had allowed it. That difference mattered. She had once wanted to believe her father was simply weak. Now she wondered whether weakness could become its own kind of betrayal. Mr. Vale watched her carefully. Lady Ottilie, when this becomes public, there will be consequences beyond documents. Ottilie looked toward the window. She knew. The Ashcombes had spent generations protecting their name. A family scandal would spread through every drawing room in the county. Friends would choose sides. Invitations would disappear. People who had laughed beside Corisande might suddenly claim they had always suspected her. Ottilie understood society. She knew how quickly admiration could become judgment, but she also understood something else. Silence had protected the wrong people for long enough. That evening, another conversation took place behind a closed door, but this time, Ottilie was not the one outside listening. She stood in the hallway as her father called her name. Ottilie. She entered the study. Lord Edmund stood near the fireplace. For once, he did not look like the master of Ashcombe Manor. He looked like a man facing the consequences of his own choices. I know you have been gathering information. Ottilie did not deny it. Yes. He nodded slowly. You have your mother's determination. She looked at him. My mother had your trust. The words were quiet, but they landed heavily. Lord Edmund looked away. I failed her, and me. A long silence followed. Not the silence of anger. The silence of 2 people standing beside a wound that had existed for years. Finally, he spoke. When your mother died, I was lost. Corisande offered order when everything felt uncertain. Ottilie's expression did not change. Order is not the same as justice. No, he lowered his head. It is not. For a moment, she saw regret. Real regret. But regret did not erase the past. It did not return the letters. It did not restore the years she spent believing she was unwanted. Why did you sign those papers? Her father closed his eyes briefly. Because I believed I was protecting the estate. The answer was painful because it was honest. Not because I believed you were incapable. Because I feared losing everything. Ottilie looked at the man who had once carried her as a child through the gardens of Ashcombe Manor. The memory remained. So did the betrayal. Fear may explain a choice, father, but it does not remove responsibility. Lord Edmund accepted the words without defending himself. That was the first time Ottilie saw him do something she had waited years to see. He listened. Before she left, he spoke again. What will you do when the truth comes out? Ottilie stopped at the door. She thought of the drawing room, the laughter, the cruel words about her scar, the way everyone had believed the easiest version of the story. Then she answered, I will not destroy this family. A pause. I will simply stop allowing it to destroy me. She walked away, but neither of them noticed that the conversation had not remained private. At the end of the corridor, behind the half-open door of the old music room, Corisande stood completely still. She had heard enough. Enough to know that Edmund was no longer firmly on her side. Enough to know Ottilie had found documents. Enough to understand that the girl she had dismissed for years had become the greatest threat to everything she had built. That night, Corisande did not write letters. She did not give orders. She did not pretend calm. For the first time, she acted out of fear. And before sunrise, she would make one final attempt to remove the evidence that could bring her downfall. But she had forgotten one important thing. Ottilie Ashcombe was no longer the only person watching. Corisande did not sleep. The candles in her chamber burned lower as she sat at her writing desk, staring at the blank sheet before her. For years, she had believed every problem could be solved with patience, a carefully chosen word, a carefully placed rumor, a carefully timed appearance of concern. She had never needed to raise her voice because people like Edmund Ashcombe had always been easier to guide when they believed they were making their own decisions. But Ottilie was different. That was what frightened her. Ottilie had stopped asking for permission to exist. Near midnight, Corisande opened the locked drawer of her desk and removed a small brass key. The same key Emily had seen. The same key Ottilie now knew existed. She walked through the darkened corridors toward the library, carrying only a candle. But she did not notice the figure at the far end of the hallway. Mrs. Bell stood in the shadows. The old housekeeper had not followed her out of curiosity. She followed because she had spent too many years watching people take advantage of those who trusted them. When Corisande entered the library, Mrs. Bell moved quietly toward the servants' passage. There was another way into the room, a way known only to those who had served Ashcombe Manor for decades. Inside the library, Corisande unlocked the lower cabinet beneath the writing desk. Her hands moved quickly, not searching, destroying. She removed several papers and held them near the candle flame. But before the first page caught fire, a voice stopped her. "I would not do that." Corisande turned sharply. Mrs. Bell stood in the doorway. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Corisande gave a cold smile. "You forget your position." "No." Mrs. Bell's voice remained steady. "I remember it very clearly." She stepped into the room. "I am a servant. I have spent my life opening doors for people like you." A pause. "But I have also spent my life seeing what happens behind them." Corisande narrowed her eyes. "You believe a housekeeper can challenge me?" Mrs. Bell looked at the papers in her hand. "No. I believe the truth does not require permission." The words unsettled Corisande more than an accusation would have, because they were not emotional, they were certain. Corisande placed the papers down slowly. "You have no idea what you are interfering with." Mrs. Bell looked toward the documents. "Perhaps, but I know exactly what you are afraid of." For the first time that night, Corisande had no immediate reply, because she knew the old woman was right. The danger had never been the papers alone. It was the people who remembered, the servants who had watched, the villagers who had noticed, the witnesses she had considered too insignificant to matter. Meanwhile, Ottilie sat awake in her chamber, unable to ignore the feeling that something was changing. She had spent years waiting for the powerful to decide her future. Now she understood something she had never been taught. Power was not only held by those who owned land. Sometimes it belonged to those who carried memories. A soft knock came at her door. It was Mrs. Bell, but the expression on her face told Ottilie immediately that something had happened. She let the housekeeper enter. "What did you find?" Mrs. Bell placed a folded paper on the table. "Not what I found, what I stopped." Ottilie unfolded it carefully. The document was damaged at the edge. A small section had been burned, but enough remained, enough to reveal a name. Corisande. Ottilie looked up. She tried to destroy it. Mrs. Bell nodded. But she failed. Ottilie stared at the damaged paper. For years, she had searched for proof that she had not imagined everything. Now the proof was appearing piece by piece, not through luck, through people choosing to speak. She folded the document carefully. "Thank you." Mrs. Bell shook her head. "No, my lady, thank yourself." Ottilie looked confused. "Why?" "Because years ago you saved a child on a road when everyone else stepped away." The old woman smiled faintly. "Some people spend their lives believing kindness makes them weak. They are wrong." Ottilie looked down at the scar along her face. For the first time in years, she did not see the mark as something her family had used against her. She saw the moment it came from, the moment she had chosen to act, the moment she had been brave before anyone called her brave. By morning, Ashcombe Manor would appear unchanged. The same walls, the same halls, the same carefully arranged appearances, but beneath that surface, the balance had shifted. Because Corisande still had secrets, Ottilie now had evidence. And soon, the entire household would learn that the woman they had mocked for her scar was carrying the one thing their pride could not survive, the truth. The following morning, Ashcombe Manor received visitors, not the kind Corisande expected. She had prepared herself for accusations from Ottilie. She had prepared herself for tears, anger, even a dramatic confrontation. What she had not prepared for was calm. Ottilie entered the morning room, carrying a small folder of papers. She did not slam them onto the table. She did not demand attention. She simply placed them before her father. Lord Edmund looked at the documents. "What are these?" "Records." His eyes moved toward Corisande. She remained seated, but her posture had changed. She was no longer the woman controlling the room. She was a woman waiting to see how much had been discovered. Ottilie spoke quietly. "I have spent years believing I was unwanted because of something I could not change." Her fingers touched the edge of the folder, my scar. The room became still. "But I understand now that my scar was never the reason I was pushed aside." Corisande's expression hardened. "Careful, Ottilie?" The warning was familiar. Years ago, those words would have stopped her. Not anymore. Ottilie continued. "The reason was that I had a claim you wanted controlled." Lord Edmund looked down at the papers again. The account records, the missing arrangements, the signatures. His face grew pale. Corisande stood. "This is ridiculous." "Is it?" Ottilie turned toward her. "Then explain why these records were hidden. Explain why my mother's letters were never given to me. Explain why Mr. Carlyle was searching the library after I began asking questions." Each question landed harder than the last, not because they were shouted, because they were impossible to ignore. Corisande looked toward Edmund. "You cannot seriously listen to this." But Edmund did not immediately answer. And that hesitation was the answer itself. For the first time, Corisande realized she was losing control of the person she had relied on most. "Your father knows how complicated these matters are." Ottilie looked at Edmund. "Do you?" The question was not an accusation. It was a request for honesty. Lord Edmund sat heavily. "I knew some documents had been moved." Ottilie's expression changed slightly. "Some?" He closed his eyes. "I did not know the full extent, but you knew enough." The words were soft, and they hurt, because they were true. Lord Edmund looked at his daughter. "I thought I was protecting the family," Ottilie answered immediately. "No, you were protecting its appearance." Silence followed, not the silence of embarrassment, the silence of a truth finally spoken aloud. Before anyone could continue, a servant appeared at the doorway. "My lord, there is another arrival." "Who?" "Mr. Vale." The solicitor entered moments later, but he was not alone. Behind him stood the former estate accountant, Mr. Carlyle. The room changed instantly. Corisande looked at him with surprise. "Why are you here?" Mr. Carlyle removed his hat. "Because I believe I have been given an opportunity to correct a mistake." Corisande's face tightened. "A mistake?" The accountant looked uncomfortable. He had spent years serving the Ashcombes. He understood what it meant to speak against those who employed him, but he also understood something else. There came a moment when silence became its own confession. "I was instructed to adjust certain records after Lady Eleanor's death." Lord Edmund looked up. "By whom?" Mr. Carlyle hesitated. "By Lady Corisande." The room went completely quiet. Corisande stared at him. "You are lying." No one moved. Mr. Carlyle swallowed. "I wish I were." Ottilie watched him carefully. This was the first time she had seen someone from the upper rooms of Ashcombe Manor admit the truth. Not because they were forced, because they had finally understood the cost of remaining silent. Mr. Vale placed another document on the table, a written statement, signed by Mr. Carlyle, and supported by the remaining records. Corisande reached for it. Mr. Vale stopped her. "I believe Lady Ottilie should read it first." Ottilie opened the statement. It confirmed what her mother had suspected. Funds had been redirected, letters had been intercepted, records had been altered, but one detail surprised her. The first request to remove Ottilie from the estate had not come after Eleanor's death. It had begun months earlier, before her mother died. Ottilie looked up. "Why?" No one answered. Then Mrs. Bell, who had entered quietly behind Mr. Vale, spoke. "Because Lady Eleanor discovered the truth." Everyone turned. The old housekeeper stepped forward. She knew Lady Corisande intended to gain control over more than the estate. She intended to make certain Ottilie had no reason to remain. Corisande's voice became sharp. "You have no right," Mrs. Bell interrupted. "I have spent 30 years listening. Today I am finally speaking." The words carried through the room, and this time no one laughed. Ottilie looked at the people gathered there, the family who had ignored her, the servants who had remembered, the solicitor who had preserved the evidence, the accountant who had finally admitted his role. The truth was no longer hidden in a locked library. It was standing in the room, but one question remained. If Corisande had been planning this before Eleanor's death, what had she known that made her so desperate to control Ashcombe Manor? And the answer was waiting inside the final page of Eleanor Ashcombe's papers. Ottilie unfolded the final page with careful hands. Unlike the other documents, this one did not contain figures or signatures. It contained a letter written by Eleanor Ashcombe only days before her death. The room remained silent as Ottilie read. "My dear Ottilie, if this page has reached you, then those who wished to silence me have failed." She stopped for a moment. The words felt impossible. Her mother had known, not suspected. Known. Eleanor had written that after reviewing the estate records, she discovered Corisande had been attempting to secure influence over Ashcombe Manor by creating a false appearance of necessity. But the most important truth was not about money. It was about the family name. Corisande had discovered that the future of Ashcombe Manor did not depend only on inheritance. It depended on trust. The estate had long been respected because previous generations had maintained honest relationships with tenants, workers, and the surrounding village. A scandal involving dishonesty would damage far more than a fortune. It would destroy the reputation Corisande valued above everything else. Ottilie lowered the letter. So this was never only about money. Mr. Vale nodded. No, it was about control. Corisande's expression changed. For the first time, her carefully arranged appearance failed completely. She had spent years building an image of herself as the woman who preserved Ashcombe Manor. But now everyone in the room understood the truth. She had been protecting herself. Lord Edmund looked toward his wife. "Did you know she had discovered this?" Corisande did not answer. That silence was enough. His face fell. "How long?" Still no answer. "How long did you know my wife understood what you were doing?" The question was quieter than anger, and somehow more painful. Because Edmund was not asking as a husband. He was asking as a man who finally realized he had chosen comfort over truth. Corisande lifted her chin. "You speak as if I acted alone." Everyone looked at her. And for a moment, Ottilie wondered if she would finally admit everything. Instead, Corisande turned toward Edmund. "You allowed me to make decisions because you wanted someone else to carry the burden." The accusation struck him. Because part of it was true, but truth spoken by the wrong person did not erase responsibility. Ottilie stepped forward. Perhaps father failed to act. But that does not make your choices his. Corisande looked at her. There it was again. That calm. That impossible calm that had replaced the frightened girl she once controlled. "You think winning this will make you happy?" Ottilie considered the question. For years, she had imagined this moment. She had imagined exposing every lie. She had imagined the satisfaction of seeing those who mocked her finally ashamed. But standing there, surrounded by proof, she felt something different. Not triumph, freedom. "No," Ottilie answered. "I think knowing the truth will allow me to decide what happens next." The simplicity of the answer unsettled everyone. Because Corisande had spent years believing Ottilie wanted revenge, she had never considered that Ottilie wanted something far more dangerous, a life that belonged to herself. Mr. Vale gathered the documents. These matters will need to be reviewed properly. Certain records may need to be presented to the appropriate authorities, and the estate arrangements must be corrected. Corisande looked toward the solicitor. "You would involve outsiders?" Mr. Vale remained composed. "Lady Corisande, the moment a private matter affects other people, it stops being private." Those words reached beyond the room. Because Ashcombe Manor had always survived by keeping everything inside its walls. But walls could not protect a family from the truth forever. In the days that followed, the consequences came quietly. There was no dramatic scene. No public spectacle in the streets. Only the slow closing of doors. Letters stopped arriving for Corisande. Invitations that once came regularly disappeared. People who had praised her elegance suddenly remembered other conversations. The same society that had laughed at Ottilie's scar now whispered about Corisande's dishonesty. Ottilie noticed the irony. The world that had judged her for a mark on her skin was finally judging someone for the choices they had made. But she did not find satisfaction in it. She found peace. She spent more time in the village, not as a woman escaping Ashcombe Manor, as a woman building something beyond it. With the help of Mr. Vale and the remaining estate accounts, she created a small charitable arrangement for women who had been left without support after losing their families or husbands. It was not a grand institution. It was not designed to make her famous. It was simply useful. The kind of thing her mother would have valued. Lord Edmund changed as well. Not quickly, not perfectly. But honestly, one evening, he found Ottilie in the garden. The winter had begun to loosen its grip. The frost had faded from the paths, and small signs of spring had appeared beneath the old trees. He stood beside her quietly. The garden was the one place at Ashcombe Manor where neither of them felt the need to perform. "I owe you an apology." Ottilie looked at him. He continued, "Not only for what I failed to stop, for what I allowed you to believe about yourself." She looked away. "For years I thought your silence meant you accepted everything." A pause. "I was wrong." Ottilie touched the scar near her face. "This was the first thing people noticed about me." Her father looked at it. "I know, but I do not see what they saw anymore." "What do you see?" He answered honestly. "Courage." The word remained between them, not because it erased the past, because it finally named what had been there all along. Ottilie smiled faintly. For the first time in her life, she believed the scar belonged to her, not to the people who used it against her, not to the family who misunderstood it, to her. And that was the moment she understood that dignity was never something another person could grant. It was something she had carried, even when everyone else refused to recognize it. Months later, when Ottilie entered a crowded hall at Ashcombe Manor, the same kind of room where she had once been humiliated, no one laughed, no one whispered, no one looked away. They looked at her, and this time, they saw her clearly. The woman with the scar was never someone who needed to be pitied. She had been the one person in the room brave enough to face the truth. Courage is not the absence of wounds. It is the choice to stand despite them. If this story of courage and justice touched you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and support us for more stories of forgotten voices finding their truth. The words remained in the hall long after Ottilie finished speaking. No one rushed to fill the silence. The people gathered there had once watched her stand alone beneath the chandelier while her family turned her pain into entertainment. They had seen her lowered eyes and mistaken them for weakness. Now they understood what they had failed to see. She had not been defeated. She had been enduring. Among those present was a woman who had once laughed quietly beside Corisande during that cruel evening. She approached Ottilie afterward, her expression uncertain. "Lady Ottilie." Ottilie turned. The woman lowered her gaze. "I owe you an apology." For a moment Ottilie said nothing, not because she wanted to punish her, because she knew apologies could not erase what had happened, but she also knew that acknowledging the truth mattered. "Thank you for saying it." The woman looked surprised. "That is all?" Ottilie gave a small, thoughtful smile. "What else should I ask for?" The woman had no answer, because Ottilie had finally reached a place where she no longer needed everyone who had hurt her to suffer before she could heal. She only needed them to stop pretending. Later, this is a backyard project, the same garden where she had once hidden after cruel remarks. The same garden where she had once wondered whether she would ever belong anywhere. The winter air was still cold, but it no longer felt like punishment. The difference was not the weather, it was her. She had changed. For the first time in her life, she walked through Ashcombe Manor without wondering whether she deserved to be there. She did not need the approval of those who had refused to see her. She did not need the admiration of those who only valued appearances. She had built something stronger, a life chosen by herself. Near the edge of the garden, she found a small wooden bench where her mother had often sat while reading. Ottilie placed her hand against the worn surface. She thought about Eleanor's words. A quiet person was not a powerless person. She finally understood why her mother had left those words behind. Because the world often mistook gentleness for surrender. But gentleness could survive storms. It could gather evidence. It could protect others. It could stand in a room full of powerful people and speak the truth. Behind her, the lights of Ashcombe Manor glowed warmly through the windows. For years, Those lights had represented a place where she was judged. Now they represented something different, a place where she had reclaimed her own voice. And somewhere beyond those walls, beyond the opinions of society and the expectations of families, Ottilie Ashcombe knew one thing with certainty. The scar that others had used to define her had become the mark that reminded her who she had always been. Not broken, not defeated, courageous. The word stayed with Ottilie longer than any praise she had ever received. Courage was never something she had searched for. She had spent years believing courage belonged to those who stood in grand rooms and commanded attention, to those with titles, wealth, and influence. But she had learned differently. Courage had been the moment she stepped forward on a muddy road to save a child. Courage had been the moment she opened her mother's letter despite fearing what it might reveal. Courage had been the moment she stood before her own family and refused to accept a false version of herself. It had not arrived as a grand gesture. It had appeared quietly, again and again, until one day she realized it had been there all along. The seasons changed over Ashcombe Manor. The winter that had once seemed endless finally gave way to gentler mornings. The fires in the great rooms were lit less often. The gardens began to return to life, and the paths where Ottilie had once walked alone became places where people gathered again. But the estate itself was never quite the same, not because the walls had changed, because the people inside them had. The servants no longer lowered their voices when Ottilie entered a room. The villagers no longer looked at Ashcombe Manor as a distant place of privilege. And Lord Edmund, though he could not undo the years he had lost, began spending the remaining years of his life trying to become the father he should have been from the beginning. There were still moments when the past returned, a familiar hallway, a certain expression from an old acquaintance, a reminder of the evening when laughter had filled the drawing room at her expense. But those memories no longer controlled her. They were chapters, not chains. One morning, Ottilie stood before the mirror in her chamber and looked at the scar that had once caused so many people to judge her. She remembered Corisande's cruel words. She remembered being told that it was the only inheritance she deserved, and she almost smiled, because Corisande had been wrong. The scar was not her inheritance. Her strength was, her compassion was, her ability to stand when others expected her to fall was. Years later, people would tell different versions of the story. Some would say Lady Ottilie Ashcombe had survived a family scandal. Some would say she had exposed corruption within one of England's respected estates. Some would focus on the papers, the accounts, and the consequences that followed. But those who truly understood her story knew it had never been only about documents. It had been about a woman who had been told she was less valuable because she was not perfect. A woman who had been judged before she was understood. A woman who discovered that the things others used to diminish her could become the very things that made her impossible to break. And in the garden where she had once questioned whether she belonged, Ottilie finally found the answer. She had never needed to earn her place. She had only needed to stop allowing others to take it away. The scar remained. The memories remained. But so did the woman who had carried them. And that was enough.